Hi everyone, it's Miss Shan, and today I'm going to do a lecture on events that led up to the Civil War and all the kind of things that contributed to the tension between the North and the South. Okay, so let's just start off with going back a little bit beyond and talk about political parties for a moment. So remember that the War of 1812 really killed off the Federalist Party, which had been a really powerful political party before then. Most politicians were this era, the kind of the 1812 to about 1850 era, belonged to a party called Democratic Republicans that was formed by Thomas Jefferson that favored a small central government. They weren't anti-federalists; they still wanted a central government, but they didn't want a expansive central government on the same scale that the Federalists had. In 1828, Andrew Jackson formed the Democratic Party in an attempt to get the presidency. And at this time, Democrats supported smaller farmers and workers rather than the wealthy, and a decentralized government with strong support of individual states' rights. So definitely more on the scale of anti-federalism. Most Democrats were Southerners, and Democrats almost unanimously supported slavery at this point. Okay, and so also remember that the balance of power in Congress really depended on representation, right? How many representatives the state had depended on the Three-Fifths Compromise, right? That the other people, the slaves, would count as 3/5 of a citizen, a white person, right? So that meant that if you had a large population of slaves, you might get extra representation. So it was in the slave states' economic and political interest to keep slavery. And what was really concerning for a lot of them was that as new states began to enter the Union with the expansion of the territory, that some states would enter as free states and thus change the balance of which kind of state, free or slave, had power in Congress. So kind of like today we talk about, Democrats have the majority in the House and Republicans have the majority in the Senate. It was kind of a similar thing, but with slave and free states, right? And each kind of side wanted to control the Congress. And so as new states begin to enter and decide whether they're free or slave, it becomes a really big issue. Okay, so let's get into talking about events. One of the first things on like the road to the Civil War was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which you should have read about the other day. This admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. And that was often the compromise, that one state would enter as slave, one state would enter as free. And it also divided the Louisiana Purchase territory into a free part above a certain latitude and a slave part below a certain latitude. So kind of continuing this tradition of the southern area of the United States having slaves and the northern area having less slaves. Okay. So you can see here, this is a map of the Missouri Compromise, right? The green are the slave states, the red are the free states. This orange territory is free territory, and this yellow territory is slave territory. And the idea was that as the US continued across, right, this kind of dividing line would continue as well. Okay. So the next event on the timeline was a rebellion by slaves called Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. Nat Turner was a slave and he was a deeply religious man. And that's also something you'll see a lot of, is that a lot of people who worked, as we read about, for abolition were also extremely religious. And they saw this as a religious and Christian duty to end slavery. So Nat Turner gathered 70 other enslaved people, as well as some freedmen, and led an uprising against whites and slave owners in a town called Southampton, Virginia. The rebels killed about 60 people, mostly white people, before being brutally put down by local militia and 3 companies of artillery, right? So they like called out the army to put down this slave revolt. And after it was stopped, Nat Turner and 55 other enslaved people who had participated in the rebellion were executed. And after that, the militia and white slave owners continued to kind of go on a rampage and slaughter enslaved people and free blacks for the next few weeks in retaliation. right? And this was kind of one of the signals that the argument over slavery and non-slavery might turn violent. Okay, next was the Compromise of 1850. So remember, 1848, the US gets the Mexican cession territory from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So basically now the US has to decide whether that territory and those new states are going to be free or slave. So California decides to enter as a free state. The Southwest Territory, so this purple area, opens to slavery. So these are not states yet, it's territory, but it is open to slavery. The other piece of the compromise was ending the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but then on the other side of that was enacting a federal fugitive slave law. And that meant that any enslaved person that escaped slavery, even if they escaped into a free state where slavery was illegal, they had to be returned to the slave owner. So that meant essentially that even in free states, those states could not enforce the law of their laws of slavery being illegal because the slaves still had to be returned, right? So again, setting up a next like kind of notch of tension over these free and slave states. Okay, so at this point, the Compromise of 1850 made many people unhappy, like a lot of compromises do, right? It never pleases one side or the other, and kind of everyone ends up unhappy. And so what happens is that Northerners found the Republican Party in 1854, kind of as a result of the Compromise of 1850. The Republican Party was divided, even initially, between abolitionists who wanted to 100% end slavery across the United States. And they were known as radical Republicans, right? They wanted slavery to be ended everywhere. And then what were called the free soilers, who wanted to prevent slavery from becoming legal in new states, but allow existing slave states to keep slavery. So they basically were saying, okay, we'll let the slave states keep their enslaved people, but we'll stop any other territories from entering as slave states, right? And kind of that was their compromise. Okay, and then just one last thing. So I've mentioned Republicans and Democrats, and this is the origins of the two political parties we have now. But it is really important to remember that Republicans, Democrats have significantly changed their demographics and platforms since the 1860s. In fact, they've almost entirely swapped, right? And so to assign historical values to the modern parties is inaccurate, right? So to say that Democrats now are the same as Democrats from the 1860s or 1850s, that doesn't mean anything, right? Because the parties have changed so rapidly, really, or so hugely. The only thing that has really stayed the same is the name. Okay. All right, so more events on the timeline. Another event was the publication of a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, written by the famous abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, who you read about. This was one of the first widely published narratives to explore life as a slave. Even though Harriet Beecher Stowe was a white lady, she wrote from the perspective of enslaved peoples. And this book was enormously popular. It was the second most popular book of the 19th century after the Bible. So in the 1800s, millions of people read this book. It was like #1 bestseller. Right? And it was used as an example by abolitionists to argue for the end of slavery, and kind of one of the things that contributed to abolition becoming more popular. Okay, then we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned the Missouri Compromise by letting settlers in Nebraska and Kansas vote to determine if their states would be free or slave, right? So instead of saying, okay, Kansas is going to enter as a free state, right, or Nebraska is going to enter as a slave state, basically Congress said, we'll leave it up to you, right? The voters decide. And this was called popular sovereignty, the idea that the people would have the decision over whether or not their state would have slavery be legal or not. But what this actually ended up in is a huge amount of violence. And this was a period of time called Bleeding Kansas. So for the next really 6 or 7 years, people on both sides, abolitionists and anti-abolitionists, in fact, uprooted their whole lives and moved to these new territories and then fought over this popular sovereignty vote, and sometimes literally fought violently. And the estimates are it killed as many as 56 people over 6 years in these kind of abolition versus anti-abolitionist arguments and riots and protests, right? It was like a lot of violence over this argument. So you can see here, this is in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So it's gotten rid of that 1820 compromise, right? And now we have these new territories that are open to slavery through popular sovereignty, right? Versus this green, which is the free territory, and blue, which is the slave states and territory. Okay. Then we have the Supreme Court case argued in 1857 called Dred Scott v. Sanford. And I'll move my little screen here so you can see that's Dred Scott there. This was a Supreme Court case. Dred Scott was a slave who was moved by his owners from a slave state to Wisconsin, which was a free territory at the time. And Dred Scott at this point basically says, hey, now that we live in a free territory, I should be free. So he goes to the court and decides to sue his owners for freedom on the basis that he now lived in a free territory. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided a few things. One, the Supreme Court did not have the right to ban slavery in territories. So basically the Supreme Court was saying, we're going to stay out of this argument. We will leave it up to Congress or the vote. Two, slaves were considered property, and the US cannot take away property without compensation. So therefore they could not say that Dred Scott was a free man, because that would be depriving his owners of their property. And three, slaves and all Black people were not citizens and therefore were not eligible for the protections of the Constitution, which meant that Dred Scott had no right to sue. So even if slaves moved to free territories, they had no right to the protections of the Constitution and no way to argue for their freedoms, right? So essentially this was kind of entrenching slavery within law, right? Saying that slaves and enslaved people could not be considered citizens. They were property, right? And so therefore the courts had no way to give enslaved people their freedom because they were property and not citizens. Okay. Another thing that on the timeline was John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry in 1859. So this is John Brown here. John Brown was a white abolitionist and also a religious activist. So like Nat Turner, he was an extremely religious man. He organized a band of 22 white allies and also some freed slaves to raid a government armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. So an armory is like where the government, where the military like keeps all their guns and cannons and stuff. And basically John Brown's idea was that this band would go and capture this armory and then distribute all the weapons to the enslaved people and allies around them, and then essentially start a violent uprising to free the slaves. Right? The raid was very quickly put down the next day by local militia and a cavalry unit, a horse unit, led by someone who will become very famous in the next few years, Robert E. Lee. 13 people died in the raid, and John Brown and 7 others were captured and executed for treason and rebellion. John Brown's trial and his execution attracted huge amounts of media attention, and famous authors and abolitionists of the day like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Henry David Thoreau supported him and wrote speeches and stuff. If we have more time this year, we would read some of those things because they're very moving. Right? And John Brown was really seen as a martyr for the abolitionist cause by both white allies and also enslaved people as well. Okay, then we get to the match that lights the fire, and that is the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So there were 4 major candidates for president for the presidency in 1860. One was Lincoln, who was a Republican, but he was not a radical Republican. He was a free soiler. He thought that slavery should not expand, but the South should be able to keep their slaves. Second was Samuel Breckinridge, who was a Southern Democratic candidate, and he was pro-slavery. Third was Bell, who was from a party called Constitutional Union, and basically he said, I don't have a stance on slavery, we'll continue doing the compromise thing that we have been doing. And then fourth was Douglas, who was a Northern Democratic candidate, and he was for popular sovereignty, for people being allowed to vote on whether or not they wanted slavery. So as you can imagine, having four different candidates for president split the vote in very interesting ways. So the popular vote was really kind of split between these four candidates. But the electoral vote, remember, because the president is not technically elected by the people, but by the Electoral College, the electoral vote went to Lincoln. He was elected, however, almost entirely by northern states. In fact, the southern states overwhelmingly voted for Breckinridge, the pro-slavery candidate. So this is the map here. So you can see the green is Breckinridge, the red is Lincoln, and the yellow is Bell, and the blue, only one state or two states, is Douglas, right? So you can see that, in fact, the United States was really split along these northern and southern lines, really emphasizing the division between the North and the South. And what happens right after the election is the secession, and we'll talk about that next time. Okay, have a great day, guys. Let me know if you have any questions.